This is Magnolia ASMR, and today we're going to be talking about Bigfoot. This is the second video in my Paranormal ASMR series, so if you haven't seen the first one, you should go back and watch it. So before I started all of the research into this video, I felt pretty mixed about Bigfoot. On the one hand, the excitement of there possibly being something like Bigfoot out in the wilderness. I wanted to believe in it, but there's been so many hoaxes and photoshopped pictures and things that it seemed too fake. It seemed like there are too many people who take advantage of this story for it to be real. But I did a lot of research into this video and have come out really surprised by the fact that I'm kind of a believer now. So that being said, I'm just going to lay out all the facts that I found and let you decide for yourself or not. Maybe you'll leave this video still kind of in between. Maybe he exists, maybe it doesn't. We'll see. So this video is going to be divided into 3 parts. We have the history of Bigfoot, scary encounters with Bigfoot, evidence of Bigfoot. And evidence is used very loosely because if you know anything about Bigfoot, all of the evidence that has been found, none of it's been conclusive. So let's get started. I have a lot of notes, so they're all going to be on my laptop in front of me, so if I'm looking down and scrolling, that's why. There have been myths about wild hominids roaming in the forest for hundreds of years, across cultures, across continents. There's been the Yeti, or the abominable snowman in the Himalayas, the Sasquatch in Canada, and Bigfoot in the Pacific Northwest. Smithsonian Magazine says Sasquatch has long populated the mythologies of Native American tribes, so the story of Bigfoot-like creatures has been around for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. In California, there are century-old pictographs drawn by the Yokuts people that appear to show giant creatures with long, shaggy hair that they called Mayak-Ditat, which roughly translates to hairy man. This alone is enough proof for me. Like, how could there be so many similar stories and images of this type of creature across cultures, continents, throughout the world before information could spread, before the internet, before people traveled? So many American Indian and First Nation tribes have accounts and stories dating back before colonial times that it's, for me, I think it's hard to discount them. So in the early 20th century, U.S. newspapers had whole sections devoted to miners, trappers, and gold prospectors who claimed to have seen what they called bear men or wild men. Most famously, in 1924, a group of prospectors in Mount St. Helens in Washington state claimed they were attacked by a group of 8 men. And just for reference, Mount St. Helens and Washington state are known for lots of Bigfoot sightings. That's sort of the region where a lot of this began. According to the prospectors, they were out hunting 8 miles from Spirit Lake when they saw 4 giant creatures moving through the forest, standing on 2 legs like humans. They say they shot at one of the beasts and retreated back to their cabin. That night, the men say they were awakened by huge stones being thrown against their cabin. They could feel giant bodies slamming against the walls and the doors. The ordeal lasted 2 hours before the sun came up and the animals retreated. This was huge because it was one of the first times that the legend of Bigfoot was put into the newspaper. So not only was it now just oral history but it was in the papers and media for thousands of people to see. Later in 1958, Humboldt Times highlighted a letter from a reader about loggers in Northern California who'd discovered mysterious large footprints. The journalist, Andrew Genzoli, jokingly wrote in the column alongside the letter, "Maybe we have a relative of the abominable snowman in the Himalayas." The column fascinated readers, and a follow-up article reported the loggers had given the mystery creature a name, Bigfoot. So I'm going to talk about 3 different Bigfoot experiences, and because the details are really important, I'm going to read them as I've written them down. These are all considered Class A Bigfoot encounters, which means that they were aggressive, the creatures were seen in detail, and they're just sort of more spooky encounters. Most encounters are not Class A. Most are instances where people have sort of witnessed a creature walking through the forest, or if they've seen them far away, or they've heard sounds, if you even believe that they happened. The first experience is from Tim Hall, who in the 1980s worked in Smoky Mountain National Park, and this was like a college job, so he was working with rangers and was learning a lot about the wilderness. So he was working there in college during the summer, and one day was on a search and rescue mission for a father and son who had gone missing. The father and son ended up being found. It just was miscommunication between the father and his wife about when he was coming home. But regardless, Tim and his colleagues, other college students who were working in the forest, hiked all day long in the snow trying to find this father and son, and were in the middle of the woods, and so had to end up spending the night in one of the ranger cabins that was located in the forest. This particular cabin was in an area that's super treacherous, super hard to get to. That night it also had snowed heavily, so it would have been nearly impossible for somebody to have been in that area with them. They were the only ones in the region, the only humans in the region. So there are about 6 college students, all of them in 6 different bunks in the cabin. After going to sleep, they suddenly heard a loud howling noise, and the cabin began to shake like something was pushing up against it. The man said that he'd had a lot of experience with black bears scratching at cabins, shaking tents, but had never felt anything like this. Black bears are smaller in that region, and there aren't any grizzlies or larger bears either. Tim says that all 6 of them were experienced hikers, hunters, had experience with bears, and all of them were so uncharacteristically full of fear that they couldn't move or say anything. And then it was gone. The next day, when they went outside the cabin to leave, they found tracks. There had been wind that night, so it had blown them away slightly, so you couldn't see the imprints of toes or anything detailed, but there were big impressions in the snow, not like a bear. They know that, like I said, no person was on the mountain that night because the weather had been so bad. Additionally, everyone in the park had permits that informed rangers of their location, so the boys knew that no one had been in the area. So the conditions, plus how treacherous and difficult it was to hike in the area, there was absolutely no way it could have been a prankster. And to this day, Tim really has no idea what it was. Experience number 2. So the next one took place in the 1990s. A woman who had just moved to Louisiana in a little house in the middle of nowhere with her husband had something happen in her backyard. So she says that there had been swamps behind the house and big corn stalks growing in sand. The woman's husband would get up really early in the morning, around 4:30, maybe 5, to go to work. They had a small German Shepherd puppy at the time, and the husband one morning said Please, whatever you do, stay in the house with the dog when I leave for work tomorrow. And when she asked why, he said that he had had an encounter that morning with something on the way to work. He said that he thought it was a bear. He had been on his motorcycle, and what was strange is that the bear didn't move, and he had to kind of swerve around it to even escape what it was. But he had been going very quickly, and so thought it was a bear, but wasn't sure. It also, because it was 4:30 a.m., was really dark. And the woman said, well, if it was a bear, the sound of the motorcycle should have scared it. And the man said, well, I'm not sure what it was. The next morning, when her husband left for work around 4:30 in the morning, the woman sat on the porch drinking her coffee when she heard a loud noise coming from the backyard. When she went to see what it was, she said she saw a creature digging in the trash, about 10 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair. The woman said she froze and the dog started barking. The creature stood up and screamed at her. She ran in the house, went into the bedroom, and grabbed her shotgun. She called her friend and said, you need to get up here, there's something in my backyard. She says that she could also see it pacing in the backyard like it was waiting for her. When her friend pulled up in the front yard with her headlights, the creature went away. Her friend stayed with her the rest of the day, and later they were watching TV. On the news, there was a report that someone in the neighborhood had spotted a Sasquatch that day, which was right near their home. So this is interesting because there have actually been a fair amount of reports from people saying that they've spotted Bigfoot digging in the trash, or even attacking livestock or cattle, or, messing with their homes, especially in Louisiana and southern states. It's interesting because Bigfoot reports really vary between regions in terms of what patterns and behaviors people are seeing, which begs the question, are there different types of Bigfoot? So according to the Bigfoot website, which I'll link below, there are a few kinds of Northern American Bigfoot. So we know that there's obviously the Yeti in the Himalayas and the Sasquatch from Canada, but there's also something called the skunk ape or swamp ape, which is what the woman in Louisiana likely saw. Skunk apes are allegedly found in the southern United States and dwell in swampy regions. They're often spotted wandering through campsites and foraging through dumpsters, and are considered to be the most aggressive version of North America's Bigfoot. They're also more likely to engage with and be aggressive towards humans. There's also this video I found, which I'll link below, of a supposed swamp ape that someone saw walking through a swamp in Florida. And the comments are so interesting because every single person says, I'm from Florida. There's no way this is a hoax because no sane person would walk through a swamp. There are cottonmouths, there are alligators. You just wouldn't do it. So I'm gonna link it and you can decide for yourself if the video is real or not. So the last experience is a little more recent. And this occurred in November of 2012, about an hour from Mount St. Helens in Washington State, which, like I said earlier, is a really common location for people to see Bigfoot. Two men, Woody and Wes, were going out for a night drive to talk about life and just hang out. They said they were experiencing insomnia at the time, so would oftentimes just go on long drives at night in the woods and talk and chill. They had parked at some point off the road in the middle of the woods and were sitting having a discussion. The first thing they noticed when they pulled off was that it was dead quiet. No forest noises at all, which is unusual for the area. And just to note, this experience of it being really quiet is actually a common experience that people say they have right before they see Bigfoot. It's almost like everything in the forest is too scared to make any noise to show it's there, so it's just dead silent if a Sasquatch or Bigfoot is around. Wes and Woody say they suddenly heard footsteps and something moving around the vehicle and had a feeling like they were being watched. They thought maybe it was a deer or an elk at first, but the footsteps were heavy and sounded like the animal wasn't trying to be quiet. Wes says it started to get creepy because as soon as they stopped talking, the footsteps would also stop, like whatever it was knew to stop when they stopped talking. It sounded as if the footsteps were coming towards the car and that they were maybe 2 or 3 creatures. Wes was thinking it couldn't be people because the visibility in that part of the forest was far too dark for a person to be able to walk so effortlessly without stumbling and without a flashlight. It didn't sound like an animal either, at least a recognizable animal. Woody asked if he should start the car, but Wes said no. He wanted to figure out what it was. They both had guns and listened to hear where the footsteps were coming from. Eventually they were able to hear one of the creatures come up towards the rear of the car, and 2 on the other side. At about 20 feet away, they could hear one of the creatures give a low growl from behind. Woody said it was like nothing he had ever heard. Not a bear, cougar, nothing remotely familiar. And both of them were experienced hunters, so had heard their fair share of animal noises. They heard it come closer, and before they could start the car, they heard another growl, this time so loud and ferocious that Wes said they froze in fear. Wes was trying to tell Woody to start the car, but couldn't even speak. And this part of the story reminds me so much of the first encounter that I talked about when all the men in the cabin just froze uncharacteristically. Woody says it was the strangest thing. They had pistols in hand and were still so afraid they couldn't do anything. They finally got it together and Woody was able to turn on the car and the headlights and slowly turn around to leave. About 30 feet out, Woody stopped the car to catch his breath and get himself together. They were trying to calm down and were looking around to make sure the creatures weren't still approaching. And suddenly Wes spotted something in the trees. Woody whispered to Wes, "Do you see what I'm seeing?" And it looked like a black figure in a tree, like a person but also a monkey, he says. It was shifting back and forth in the tree, almost like it was trying to get a better look at them, Wes explained. It disappeared and Wes heard from the right side of the car heavy breathing. As they went to start the car and leave, they saw it. Wes says it was the biggest thing he had ever seen in his life. The Bigfoot stepped out into the road and was walking at a diagonal towards them. According to Wes, it was 10 to 12 feet tall, with shoulders that were massive, maybe 6 feet wide, he says. Both Woody and Wes say they were able to see it in perfect detail. The arms hung down lower than would on a person. It was also slightly hunched over. In comparison to the Patterson-Gimlin film, which I'll talk about in a moment, the creature was similar in look, but much larger and more muscular. The creature then ran to the bushes, and they drove out of there. This encounter is so fascinating because it's unlike a lot of encounters in the fact that the creatures were surrounding the car. It was almost like an ambush, super aggressive, very planned. Not like many of the other encounters I've heard about. And the fact that he saw this massive Bigfoot in perfect detail. And all the encounters I chose, none of them were witnessed by people who are big Bigfoot fanatics or chasers or anything like that. These are all people who didn't really believe in Bigfoot. It just sort of stumbled upon these encounters, which I think makes them slightly more credible. So both Wes and Woody are just the most down-to-earth guys, and when you hear them talk about this encounter, they are still to this day so scared, not really knowing entirely what they saw, especially when, you know, they've lived in the region for their entire lives, and then suddenly you see this thing you had no idea existed. It's crazy. So, if you're skeptical about everything I've just shared with you, we have a little bit of evidence to go through. And this term is used loosely here because this evidence, like I said earlier, can't really be confirmed and is really disputed by different experts. Some people are totally convinced by it. Others say it's completely false. Some people are more in the middle and say that it's inconclusive. So there are really 3 types of evidence that has been collected for Bigfoot, and that includes footprints, audio, and photographs/videos. So in 1967, a photographer named Robert Patterson made a cast of a Bigfoot print that he had tracked in the forest near Eureka, California. He says he saw the creature, who was allegedly female and was hairy, black, and about 7 feet tall. Not only did Patterson get a footprint, but he also took one of the most famous videos of Bigfoot that exists today. This is the Patterson-Gimlin film. In it, Bigfoot is seen for less than a minute walking away from the observers. She was lovingly named Patty, and for decades this has been pretty much the universal modern image of Bigfoot. Over the years, there's been just relentless back and forth about whether or not this is real and authentic. In the 80s, a man even came out and said that he was in fact Patty, that he had been dressed up in a gorilla suit and was hired by Patterson and Gimlin to be in the film. And this was actually my belief up until I did research on this. I had heard about this man and thought, well, looks like a gorilla suit, this must be the answer. Except experts make a really good point that I hadn't heard. A famous movie with a gorilla suit costume came out the same year as the Patterson-Gimlin film, Planet of the Apes. Though the movie won an Academy Award for its makeup and costuming, there is absolutely no comparison between the Planet of the Apes costumes and Patty. Jeffrey Meldrum, a professor of anatomy and anthropology, says that the big bulgy costumes in Planet of the Apes shows us that we did not have the technology to make realistic gorilla costumes at the time. Where would Patterson or Gimlin have been able to find a costume so detailed that an Academy Award-winning costumer couldn't even make? In this video, Meldrum points out the different landmarks and surface anatomy they see in Patty. You can see her muscles and bones contracting as she breathes. He says, none of which ever show up in cheap off-the-shelf costumes. Is this film the real deal? I don't know. It looks so much like a costume to me. And there are some who argue that there was the technology back then to create this costume. It is a fair point that someone who won an Academy Award for costuming could not even have made something that realistic. How did Patterson and Gimlin have that? And also, why would they make a female Bigfoot? Yeah, I don't know. But it's pretty cool because it makes you look at the video entirely differently, thinking this could be real. So, audio has also been a major source of evidence for Bigfoot spotters. According to researchers, there are several types of Bigfoot calls. There are whoops, chatters, howls, screams, and a number of other strange sounds that people have come to associate with these creatures. Because this is an ASMR video, I'm not going to share any of the audio, but I'm going to link some sources below. I have to admit that if nothing convinces you of Bigfoot, this might. These sounds are weird and creepy, and when you listen to them, like, they sound otherworldly, honestly. The weirdest of these noises is a set that was recorded by Ron Moorhead in the 1970s at a secluded deer hunting camp in the Sierra Nevada. These sounds are so strange, it almost sounds like they're alien. Once they were recorded, Ron Moorhead and his friends took the audio to be studied by a professor at Wyoming University who found that it could not have been edited and that no human could have made these sounds due to the low frequency and pitch. The pitch of the sounds also indicate that whatever made them was at least 8 feet tall. You really need to listen to these noises. They're so spooky, they make your skin crawl. But Ron Moorhead's experiences in this deer camp actually extends beyond this audio footage. The deer camp where he and his friends would go each year is in a secret location that he's only revealed to a select few. So secluded and difficult to get to that there were never any other campers or hunters remotely close to them when they traveled to the Sierra Nevadas. They do this because the hunting is so great and they don't want other people to take their spot. Ron says that around the early 70s, he and his friends began noticing strange things on their yearly trips. He says they'd often hear howls and whoops that didn't sound like typical forest animals, but they sounded big. Ron and his friends had a shelter they'd built between trees and would retreat there once they heard noises at night. Although they heard them several times, they were never able to see any creatures. Ron says it felt as though they were both warning and observing him and his friends. The story was actually told in a documentary I saw by David Polaris called Missing 411, which highlights a number of strange encounters that many of the observers attribute to aliens or UFOs, and also tries to draw a connection between missing persons and possible alien encounters. So as I dug deeper into Bigfoot research, I found that there's a lot of crossover between Bigfoot and UFOs, and that there are many who think there's some type of connection. I'm not going to get into that because it's just a little too far down the rabbit hole and this video is already long. But if you're interested, there are a ton of podcasts and books on the topic. So, is Bigfoot real? I feel like he is, but obviously there's no real proof yet. But I will leave you with this. One of the podcasts I was listening to had a wildlife expert on it who made the point that it's really hard to capture photographs of any rare animal. The wolverine, for example, is most often photographed in captivity. There are very, very few photos of them in the wild because they're so hard to find, and when you do, they're fast, they run away, they're just hard to capture. So he makes the point that it's possible something exists that we haven't been able to properly photograph, able to properly see. Just because something hasn't been found isn't proof enough that it doesn't exist. Even Dr. Jane Goodall, the world's greatest expert on chimpanzees, says the existence of Bigfoot is possible. In an interview, she said, "It's so peculiar. I want to believe there is a creature, whether it's a Yeti, whether it's a Sasquatch, whether it's the Yowie in Australia or the wild man in China. My best story, which I'll tell very quickly, I went to a place in Ecuador, flew over miles and miles of untouched rainforest, landed with a little community of about 30 people, and in the area there were 6, 7 such little communities, and the only communication between them were these hunters who went from village to village with news like the old minstrels. And so I asked a translator, next time you see one of the hunters, please ask them if they've seen a monkey without a tail. That's all I said. So this guy had no idea why I was asking, and about 6 months later, I received a reply that 4 of the hunters had, and they're all separate from each other. They'd all seen monkeys without tails, and they walk upright, and they're about 6 foot tall. It's interesting. We don't really know. And I think that's what's so exciting about the idea of Bigfoot, that there could be this unknown creature we have no idea about that's just out there. So, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this kind of spooky video, and I'll see you next time.